March 15, 1944. A British nurse walks home through the darkness of wartime England. Within minutes, she will face a terror she never expected from her allies. One man will risk everything to save her. But the real battle will begin when they try to tell the truth about what happened that. Margaret Ashford pulled her wool coat tighter against the cold Devon wind as she walked the narrow country road toward home. Her feet ached from 12 hours on the hospital ward, tending to wounded soldiers and civilians alike. The blackout made navigation treacherous, but she knew every curve and hedgerow of this path. She had walked it nearly every night for 2 years. At 23, Margaret had spent her entire adult life at war. She remembered the anxiety of 1940, watching the skies for German bombers, wondering if Britain would survive. The arrival of American troops in 1942 had brought hope. Everyone said the Yanks would turn the tide. They brought supplies, confidence, and the promise of liberation for occupied Europe. The American base sat just 2 miles from her village. She often saw the soldiers in town, buying sweets for local children, chatting with shopkeepers, attending dances at the parish hall. They seemed so young, so far from home. Margaret felt grateful for their sacrifice, coming across an ocean to fight a war that wasn't originally theirs. She heard voices ahead, American accents, unmistakable. 3 men, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. Margaret's first instinct was to call out a friendly greeting, but something in their tone made her hesitate. Laughter, but not the warm kind. Sharp, predatory. "Well, what do we have here?" The first soldier stepped into her path. Even in the darkness, she could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Good evening, gentlemen. I'm just heading home from the hospital." Margaret kept her voice steady, professional. She tried to step around them. A hand grabbed her arm. "What's the hurry, sweetheart? We're just being friendly. Please let me go." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I need to get home." The second soldier moved behind her, cutting off her retreat. "You British girls are supposed to be hospitable. That's what they told us. Real friendly to American boys." Margaret tried to pull away, but the grip on her arm tightened. The third soldier, who had been silent until now, grabbed her other arm. They began pulling her toward the hedgerow, away from the road. "Stop! Let me go!" She tried to scream, but a hand clamped over her mouth. "Quiet now. Don't make this difficult." Terror flooded through. This couldn't be happening. These were Allied soldiers, the liberators, the heroes everyone celebrated. But their hands were rough, their intentions clear. She struggled, kicking, trying to bite the hand covering her mouth. "Get off her, now!" The voice came from the darkness, commanding and furious. A fourth figure emerged, running toward them. The hand released from Margaret's mouth, and she gasped for air. "Mind your own business, boy." The first soldier's voice dripped with contempt, emphasizing that last word. "I said get off her." The newcomer was close enough now that Margaret could see him, a black American sergeant's stripes visible. He was smaller than the 3 attackers, moved with absolute certainty. "You really want to do this, Coleman?" The second soldier released Margaret's arm but stepped toward the sergeant. "You know how this ends for you." Sergeant Coleman didn't hesitate. He shoved the soldier backward, hard enough to send him stumbling. Then he positioned himself between Margaret and her attackers. "The lady is going home. You 3 are going back to base. Right now." For a moment, Margaret thought they might actually fight. The tension crackled in the cold air. Then the first soldier spat on the ground. "This isn't over. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, boy." The 3 men retreated to the darkness, their threats hanging in the air. Margaret's legs nearly gave out. She leaned against the hedgerow, shaking. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" The voice was gentle now, concerned. "Did they injure you?" No, I don't think so." Margaret's voice trembled. "You saved. They were going to. I know what they were going." Coleman's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I need to report this. Those men need to face justice for what they attempted." Margaret stared at him. Report it? The idea seemed almost absurd. They were American soldiers, allies, heroes. Who would believe her? Who would care? "I just want to go home," she whispered. "I understand. But if they did this to you, they'll do it to someone else. Maybe next time, no one will be there to stop them." Coleman's eyes were steady, serious. "You have my word, ma'am. I'll make sure this gets reported properly. I'll testify to everything I saw." Margaret looked at this man who had risked himself for a stranger, a man who was now promising to risk even more by reporting his fellow soldiers. She didn't know much about the American military, but she knew enough to understand that a black soldier accusing white soldiers would face consequences. "What will happen to you?" she asked. Coleman's expression didn't change. "That's not your concern, ma'am. What matters is doing the right thing." He walked her home, maintaining a respectful distance, checking over his shoulder periodically. When they reached her cottage, Margaret turned to face him. "I don't even know how to thank you, Sergeant. Coleman. James Coleman. And you don't need to thank me, ma'am. I just did what any decent person should do." He pulled out a small notebook. "I'll need your name and information for the report." Margaret provided her details, still feeling surreal about the entire situation. This man had saved her life, and now he was calmly taking notes as if this were routine procedure. Someone from the military police will contact you tomorrow to take your statement, Coleman said. Tell them everything, exactly as it happened. Don't let anyone convince you to minimize it or forget about it. Will I see you again? Margaret asked. Coleman's expression flickered just for a moment. I don't know, ma'am, but I'll make sure justice. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Margaret standing at her door, trying to process what just happened. Inside, she sat in her kitchen, still wearing her coat, staring at nothing. The men who had attacked her were supposed to be heroes. The man who saved her would likely be punished for it. Nothing made sense. What Margaret didn't know that night was that her experience was far from unique. By the time the war ended in 1945, more than 400 documented cases of sexual assault by American GIs would emerge from military archives. 126 of those cases occurred in the United Kingdom alone. But these numbers represented only the cases that were officially reported and recorded. Researchers who later studied this dark chapter of history estimated that the true number of victims across Europe likely reached into the thousands. The vast majority of assaults were never reported, never investigated, never punished. The reasons for this silence were complex and deeply troubling. The British government had made a calculated decision. The alliance with America was essential for winning the war and securing Britain's future. Incidents involving American soldiers, particularly serious crimes, threatened to strain that relationship. Official policy, documented in declassified memos, instructed British authorities to handle such incidents with utmost discretion to preserve Anglo-American relations. This discretion often meant pressure on victims to remain silent. It meant investigations that went nowhere. It meant justice deferred and ultimately denied. The women who suffered these attacks found themselves caught between their trauma and their patriotic duty. Speaking out meant being labeled as troublemakers, as threats to the war effort, as women of questionable character. The morning after the attack, Margaret reported to the hospital as usual. She told no one what had happened. Her hands shook as she changed bandages and administered medications. Every American soldier she saw made her flinch, even though she knew most were decent men. The three from last night had poisoned everything. At noon, 2 American military police officers arrived at the hospital, asking for her. They took her to a private office, where a British police liaison officer was also present. Everyone looked uncomfortable. Miss Ashford, we understand you had an incident last night. The senior MP. He was older, probably in his 40s, with tired eyes. Sergeant Coleman filed a report. We need your statement. Margaret told them to walk home. The 3 soldiers, their hands on her, the terror, Coleman's intervention. She tried to keep her voice steady, but tears came anyway. The British officer handed her a handkerchief and looked away, embarrassed. The MPs took notes, asked clarifying questions. Their tone was professional, but not warm. When she finished, the senior MP closed his notebook. Miss Ashford, are you absolutely certain you want to pursue this matter? He asked. The question stunned her. I'm sorry? These are serious allegations. The investigation will be thorough and, frankly, difficult. Your name will be in official reports. You'll need to testify, possibly multiple times. The defense will question your character, your movements, your choices that. He leaned forward. Are you prepared for that? Margaret looked at the British liaison officer, hoping for support. He studied his own notebook, avoiding her eyes. Those men attacked me, she said quietly. Sergeant Coleman stopped them. That's what happened. That's the truth. The truth can be complicated in wartime, the MPs. We're not questioning what you experienced. We're asking if you understand what pursuing this will mean for you personally. The message was clear. Drop it. Forget it. Move on. For the good of the alliance, for the war effort, for everyone's convenience, just let it go. I understand, Margaret said, and I want to proceed. Those men should face consequences. The MPs exchanged glances. The senior one nodded slowly. Very well. We'll be in touch. After they left, Margaret sat alone in the office, shaking. She had expected them to be outraged on her behalf, eager to pursue justice. Instead, they seemed annoyed that she was making trouble. The pressure began almost immediately. That evening, a local magistrate appeared at her family's door. He was a friend of her father's, a respected member of the community. He asked to speak with Margaret privately. My dear, I've heard about your unfortunate experience, he said, settling into her father's armchair. Terrible business, but I want you to think carefully about how you proceed. I've already given my statement, Margaret said. Yes, but statements can be withdrawn. Misunderstandings can be clarified. He smiled, paternal and condescending. We must think of the larger picture. The alliance with America is crucial. These incidents, when they become official matters, they create tensions, diplomatic complications. I was attacked, Margaret said, her voice harder now. That's not a diplomatic complication, that's a crime. Of course. No one is minimizing what happened to you, but consider the alternative. These soldiers will be disciplined quietly, internally. You avoid the ordeal of testimony, the scrutiny, the gossip. Everyone moves forward. He leaned in. Think of your family, Margaret, your father's position in the community, your own reputation. Once these things become public, the stain never quite washes away. After he left, Margaret's father came to her room. He looked older than she remembered, worn down by years of war and worry. Margaret, perhaps the magistrate has, he said quietly. I don't want to see you hurt any more than you already have been. So I should just pretend it didn't happen? I'm saying you should think about what's best for your future. For all of us. He couldn't meet. These are powerful forces you're confronting. The American military, the British government, they have ways of making things difficult who cause problems. Margaret realized with cold clarity that she was alone in this. Even her own father was asking her to be silent. The village gossip started within days. Margaret heard the whispers when she walked to the shops, saw the sidelong glances. Mrs. Patterson, who had known her since childhood, crossed the street to avoid speaking with her. At the hospital, colleagues became distant. The story spreading through the village bore little resemblance to what actually happened. In this version, Margaret had been out late, possibly drinking. She had been friendly with American soldiers, perhaps too friendly. When things went wrong, she cried assault to protect her reputation. The black soldier who intervened was either a troublemaker or part of some scheme. Margaret wanted to scream the truth, but she knew it wouldn't matter. People believed what was convenient, what fit their existing narrative. A nice British girl attacked by American heroes? Impossible. A girl who made poor choices and regretted them? That made sense to them. 2 weeks after the incident, Margaret received a summons to meet with the American base commander. She arrived at the base gates, was escorted through security, and shown into an office where a colonel sat behind a massive desk. Miss Ashford, thank you for coming. He didn't stand or offer his hand. I wanted to discuss this unfortunate situation personally. I'm listening, Margaret said. The 3 soldiers you've accused are from good families. One's father is a congressman. Another's uncle is a general. These are not troublemakers or criminals. They're patriots who volunteered to fight for freedom. He steepled his fingers. Sergeant Coleman, on the other hand, has a history of insubordination. Complaints from other soldiers about his attitude. He saved my life, Margaret said. Perhaps? Or perhaps he saw an opportunity to cause trouble for white soldiers he resents. We've seen this before. Racial tensions within the ranks. Some men use false accusations as weapons. The colonel's voice was smooth, reasonable. I'm not saying you're lying, Miss Ashford. I'm saying you may have misinterpreted what happened. It was dark. You were frightened. Coleman arrived and created a narrative that fit his agenda. It felt sick. They were going to twist everything, make Coleman the villain and her the confused victim. I know what happened, she said firmly. I know who attacked me and who saved me. The colonel sighed. These proceedings will be very difficult for you. The defense attorneys will ask about your personal life, your relationships, your movements that night. They'll suggest you were drinking, that you encouraged attention from soldiers, that you're fabricating this story for various possible reasons. He paused. They'll destroy your reputation to protect their clients, and they'll probably succeed. You threatening me? Margaret asked. I'm warning you, as a courtesy. You seem like a decent young woman who's been through something traumatic. I'd hate to see you traumatized further by a brutal legal process that ultimately goes nowhere. He stood, signaling the meeting was over. Think about it. You can still withdraw your statement. No one would blame you. Margaret left the base feeling hollowed out. They weren't going to pursue justice. They were going to protect the attackers and punish anyone who threatened that protection. What Margaret didn't fully understand yet was the racial dimension of her case. The American military in World War II was strictly segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, typically assigned to support roles rather than combat. They faced discrimination and violence not just from the enemy, but from their own white comrades. Racial tensions within the American military were severe and well documented. White soldiers frequently assaulted black soldiers, sometimes fatally. Military police often ignored these attacks or blamed the victims. When black soldiers defended themselves, they faced harsh punishment. The situation was complicated further by British civilian attitudes. Many British people, particularly in rural areas, had never encountered black Americans before. Initial prejudices often gave way to positive interactions. Black American soldiers were frequently welcomed in British pubs, homes, and social events. This infuriated many white American soldiers, who expected British civilians to enforce the same segregation they practiced at home. There were documented cases of white American soldiers demanding that British pub owners refuse service to black soldiers. Most British publicans refused these demands, leading to violent confrontations. The irony was profound and painful. America was fighting against Nazi racial ideology while maintaining its own system of racial oppression. Black soldiers were asked to risk their lives for freedom abroad while being denied basic dignity at home and in the military. Sergeant James Coleman understood all of this intimately. He had grown up in rural Louisiana, where Jim Crow laws governed every aspect of life. He had joined the Army hoping military service might earn him respect, might prove his worth as an American. Instead, he found the same racism in uniform. When Coleman intervened to save Margaret, he knew exactly what consequences he faced. A black soldier physically confronting white soldiers, then filing official charges against them, was crossing every unwritten rule of military racial hierarchy. But he did it anyway, because it was right. The retaliation began immediately. Coleman's barracks became hostile territory. White soldiers who had previously been merely cold became openly threatening. Someone destroyed his personal belongings. Threatening notes appeared in his bunk. His commanding officer, a white captain from Georgia, called him in for a private conversation. "Coleman, you're making things very difficult for yourself," the captain said. "Those boys you accused, they have friends, powerful friends. You're putting a target on your back. I reported a crime, sir. That's my duty. Your duty is to maintain unit cohesion and follow orders. This crusade of yours is causing division, creating problems." The captain leaned back in his chair. "I'm giving you a chance to make this. Withdraw your statement. Say you misunderstood what you saw. We'll transfer you to another unit. Fresh start. No hard feelings." "I can't do that. I saw what I saw. I testified truthfully." The captain's expression hardened. "Then you're a fool. You're throwing away your career, maybe your life, for some British girl you don't even know. For what? Principle?" He spat the word like a curse. "Yes, sir, for principle." 2 days later, Coleman received transfer orders. He was being reassigned to a combat infantry unit preparing for the invasion of France. For a black soldier, this was unusual and ominous. Black troops were typically kept in support roles, away from frontline combat. This transfer was clearly punitive, a way to remove Coleman from the situation and possibly get him killed in the process. Coleman's fellow black soldiers understood immediately what was happening. They gathered around him the night before his transfer, offering quiet support and grim solidarity. "They're trying to silence you, send you somewhere you can't testify, or somewhere you won't come back from," another added. Coleman accepted their concerns with his characteristic calm. "Maybe, but I did the right thing. I'd do it again." Before he left, Coleman managed to get a message to Margaret, asking to meet one final time. They met in a quiet corner of the village church, away from prying eyes. Margaret barely recognized him. In just 3 weeks, he looked older, worn down by the pressure and hostility he had faced. "I'm being transferred," he said without preamble. "Combat unit, shipping out for the invasion." "Because of me," Margaret said, guilt crushing her chest. "Because you helped me. Because I did the right thing," Coleman corrected gently. "Don't take that from me. Don't make it about you. I made a choice, knowing the consequence. I'd make it again." "I'm so sorry," it whispered. "This isn't fair. You saved my life, and they're punishing you." "Fair?" Coleman smiled, but it was sad. "Ma'am, nothing about this world is fair. I learned that a long time ago. But fairness isn't the point. Doing right is the point. Being able to look at yourself in the mirror is the point. What about the case? Your testimony? They'll proceed without me. Or more likely, they'll let it die quietly. Those men will never face real consequences." He saw her expression crumble. "I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you different, but you should know the truth." They sat in silence, two people who had been thrown together by violence and were now being separated by the same system that enabled that. "I want you to know something," Margaret said finally. "You restored my faith, not in the system, not in justice, but in people, in the possibility that someone might do the right thing even when it costs them. That matters. That means something." Coleman nodded slowly. "Then it was worth it." He stood to leave, then paused. "Miss Ashford, after the war, when all this is history, tell your story. Don't let them bury it. Don't let them pretend it didn't happen. The truth matters, even if justice doesn't come." Then he was gone, walking out of the church and out of her life, heading toward the beaches of Normandy and an uncertain fate. Margaret never saw him again. The investigation into her assault continued for another month, then quietly disappeared. The 3 soldiers remained on duty, unpunished. No charges were ever filed. The official record listed the case as unsubstantiated due to insufficient evidence and conflicting testimony. Margaret tried to move on with her life, but the attack and its aftermath had changed everything. Her reputation in the village never recovered. Former friends remained distant. Job opportunities dried up. Even at the hospital, she felt the cold shoulder from colleagues who viewed her as a troublemaker. She began hearing about other women with similar experiences. A girl from the next village, attacked by American soldiers near the base. A widow in town, assaulted in her own home. A teenager, raped behind the dance hall. All of them had been pressured into silence. All of them had been told that speaking out would damage the war effort, harm the alliance, ruin their reputations. Margaret reached out to two of these women, and they met secretly in her cottage. The three of them shared their stories, their trauma, their anger at the system that had failed them so completely. "We should go to the newspapers," one woman suggested. "Tell everyone what's really happening." Margaret contacted the editor of the local paper, a man she had known for years. He listened to her story with growing discomfort. "Margaret, I believe you. I do. But I can't publish," looked genuinely pained. "Government censorship is strict. Anything that could harm morale or the alliance is forbidden. If I tried to run this story, the paper would be shut down, and I'd probably be arrested. So we just accept it? Let them get away with it?" "I'm not saying that. I'm saying I can't help you. I'm sorry." A week later, Margaret received a visit from a representative of the British Home Office. He was polite, well-dressed, and absolutely clear in his message. "Miss Ashford, we're aware that you've been discussing your allegations and attempting to contact the press. I need to make something very clear to you. Continuing this campaign could be considered undermining the war effort. That's a serious offense with serious consequences. I'm telling the truth about what happened to me. The truth is less important than the national interest. We're fighting for Britain's survival. The American alliance is essential to that survival. Your personal grievances, however legitimate they may be, cannot be allowed to jeopardize that alliance." He leaned forward. "If you continue this behavior, we will take action. Your father could lose his position. Your family could face investigation. You yourself could be detained under emergency wartime powers. Do you understand?" Margaret understood perfectly. The message was clear: shut up or suffer. Her family faced increasing pressure as well. Her father was called into his supervisor's office and warned that his daughter's behavior was reflecting poorly on him. Friends stopped visiting. The social isolation became suffocating. Margaret's mother, who had been supportive initially, finally broke down. "Please, Margaret, please just let this go. They're destroying our family. Your father might lose his job. No one will speak to us. Is this really worth it?" Margaret wanted to scream that yes, it was worth it, that justice mattered, that truth mattered. But looking at her mother's exhausted, frightened face, she felt her resolve crumbling. She was hurting everyone around her, and for what? The case was dead. Coleman was gone. The attackers were untouched. She stopped reaching out to other victims, stopped trying to contact the press, stopped fighting. The silence she had resisted for months finally claimed her. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Victory celebrations filled the streets. American soldiers prepared to return home as conquering heroes. Among them were the three men who had attacked Margaret. They boarded ships for America, their service records unblemished, their futures bright. Margaret watched the celebrations from her window, unable to participate. Everyone was so happy, so relieved. The war was over. The good guys had won. But for Margaret, there was no victory, no relief. Just the bitter knowledge that some crimes would never be punished, some truths would never be acknowledged. Her case was officially closed with a final notation: insufficient evidence to proceed. Matter resolved. But it wasn't resolved. It would never be resolved. Margaret's life after the war was quiet and lonely. She never married. The attack and the subsequent character assassination had left her unable to trust, unable to open herself to vulnerability. She continued working at the hospital for several more years, then took a position as a private nurse for elderly patients. She became increasingly reclusive, known in the village as the odd spinster who kept to herself. The story of what happened to her was gradually forgotten, or rather transformed into village legend. The details blurred. Some people remembered something about an incident with American soldiers, but the specifics were lost. Margaret never spoke about it. For decades, the truth about American military sexual violence during World War II remained buried in classified archives. The official narrative of the war had no room for such uncomfortable complications. The greatest generation had saved the world from fascism. That was the story everyone wanted to tell and hear. But in the 1970s and 1980s, historians began gaining access to wartime military records. What they discovered was shocking. The 400 documented cases of sexual assault by American GIs were just the beginning. Researchers like J. Robert Lilly began piecing together a much larger and darker picture. Lilly's groundbreaking research, published decades after the war, estimated that American soldiers committed approximately 14,000 rapes in Europe during World War II. France, Germany, and Britain all had significant numbers of victims. The vast majority of these crimes were never reported, never investigated, never punished. The research also revealed disturbing patterns in how these cases were handled. White soldiers accused of raping white women often faced minimal consequences, if any. Their cases were frequently dismissed or resulted in light sentences. Black soldiers accused of similar crimes, however, faced harsh punishment, including execution. Of the American soldiers executed for rape during World War II, a disproportionate number were black. The racial double standard was explicit and documented. The same military that protected white soldiers who committed assault showed no mercy to black soldiers accused of the same crimes. This pattern reflected the broader racial dynamics of the American military and society. Black soldiers were expected to fight and die for freedom, while being denied basic dignity and equal treatment. When they stepped out of their assigned place, as Coleman did by defending Margaret and reporting white soldiers, they faced severe retaliation. Researchers eventually located Coleman's military records. After his transfer, he served with distinction in France and Germany. He was wounded twice, once seriously. He received several commendations for bravery under fire. He survived the war and returned to Louisiana in 1946. Back home, Coleman faced the same Jim Crow segregation he had left behind. Despite his military service and decorations, he was still a black man in the Deep South. He worked various jobs, married, raised a family. He never spoke publicly about the incident in England, about saving Margaret, about the price he paid for doing the right thing. James Coleman died in 1982 at the 63. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service, but nothing about his act of courage in a dark English lane. In the 1990s, a historian researching wartime sexual assault cases contacted Margaret, now in her 70s. It was the first time in 50 years that anyone had asked her to tell her full story. At first, she refused. The memories were too painful, the betrayal too deep. But the historian was patient and persistent. She explained that Margaret's testimony could help document this hidden history, could give voice to thousands of women whose stories had been silenced. Finally, Margaret agreed. Sitting in her small cottage, now elderly and frail, Margaret told the entire story. The attack, Coleman's intervention, the pressure to stay silent, the investigation that went nowhere, the destruction of her reputation and her life. She spoke for hours, and the historian recorded every word. "Why are you willing to talk about this now?" the historian asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Because Sergeant Coleman asked me to. Before he left for France, he told me to tell my story someday, when it was history. He said the truth matters, even if justice doesn't come." Her eyes filled with tears. "He saved my life, and they punished him for it. The least I can do is honor his request." "Do you know what happened to him after the war?" "No. I tried to find out, years ago, but I had no way to track him down. I don't even know if he survived." She wiped her eyes. "I hope he did. I hope he had a good life. He deserved that much." The historian later located Coleman's records and informed Margaret that he had survived, returned home, lived a full life. Margaret wept when she heard this. Relief and grief mingled together. "I wish I could have thanked him properly. I wish I could have told him what his courage meant to me." Margaret Ashford died in 1998 at the age of 77. Her testimony became part of the historical record, one voice among many finally speaking truth about the complicated, painful reality of wartime sexual violence. The story of Margaret and Coleman forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about World War II, a conflict we prefer to remember in simple, heroic terms. The Allied victory over fascism was real and necessary. The courage of soldiers who fought and died for freedom was genuine. But within that larger truth existed smaller, darker truths that complicate our understanding. Some of the soldiers who came to liberate Europe committed terrible crimes against the people they were supposed to protect. The military and government systems that should have provided justice instead prioritized political convenience and diplomatic relations. Victims were silenced, attackers were protected, and those who tried to do the right thing were punished. The racial dimension adds another layer of complexity. Black American soldiers fought for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. They faced discrimination and violence from their own comrades. When they showed courage and integrity, as Coleman did, they often paid severe prices. Yet Coleman's choice to intervene, to report, to insist on justice despite knowing the consequence represents something profoundly important. In a system designed to protect perpetrators and silence victims, he refused to look away. He chose principle over safety, justice over convenience, human dignity over institutional loyalty. Margaret's choice to speak truth, despite enormous pressure to stay silent, despite the destruction of her reputation and her life, was equally courageous. She refused to let the system erase what happened to her. She insisted on being heard, even when no one wanted to listen. Their story is not the story we prefer to tell about World War II. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives of heroism and liberation. It's messy, painful, and morally complex. But it's true, and truth matters. The phrase, "don't tell anyone," was used repeatedly to silence victims like Margaret. British and American authorities, village leaders, even family members urged women to keep quiet about their assaults. The message was clear. Your trauma is less important than our political and social convenience. Your truth is dangerous. Your voice is a threat. But some women, like Margaret, eventually refused to stay silent. Their testimonies, recorded decades after the events, provide crucial historical documentation. They complicate our understanding of the war, forcing us to acknowledge that liberation was experienced differently by different people. For the French, Dutch, and Belgian civilians freed from Nazi occupation, American soldiers were indeed liberated. For the thousands of European women sexually assaulted by those same soldiers, the experience was far more complicated. They were caught between gratitude for liberation and trauma from violation, unable to fully express either emotion. The systematic cover-up of these crimes reveals how institutions prioritize their own interests over justice for individuals. The British government valued the American alliance more than the safety and dignity of British women. The American military valued its reputation and morale more than accountability for criminal soldiers. Both governments collaborated to suppress evidence, discourage reporting, and protect perpetrators. This pattern is not unique to World War II. Throughout history, military institutions have struggled with sexual violence within their ranks and against civilian populations. The mechanisms of cover-up and victim blaming remain remarkably consistent across different wars, different armies, different eras. What makes Margaret and Coleman's story particularly poignant is the intersection of gender and racial injustice. Margaret was silenced because she was a woman whose trauma was deemed less important than political convenience. Coleman was punished because he was a black man who challenged white soldiers and refused to accept his assigned racial hierarchy. Both were victims of systems that valued order and convenience over justice and truth. Both chose to resist those systems, knowing they would pay severe prices. Both paid those prices and lived with the consequences for the rest of their lives. The question their story poses is uncomfortable, but essential. What does courage mean when the system is designed to punish it? What does justice mean when institutions actively prevent it? What does truth mean when everyone in power wants it buried? Coleman's answer was clear. Courage means doing the right thing regardless of consequences. Justice means insisting on accountability even when it's futile. Truth means speaking what you witnessed even when no one wants to hear it. He saved Margaret's life in that dark lane, but his greater act of courage was insisting on reporting what happened, knowing it would destroy his military career and possibly his life. He chose principle over pragmatism, human dignity over institutional loyalty. Margaret's courage was equally profound. She could have accepted the pressure to stay silent, could have moved on and tried to forget. Instead, she insisted on speaking truth, on pursuing justice, on refusing to let the system erase what happened to her. When that battle was lost, she carried the truth for 50 years until someone finally wanted to hear it. Their story reminds us that history is made not just by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people making moral choices in impossible situations. Coleman was not a famous hero. Margaret was not a prominent figure. They were simply two people who refused to look away from injustice, who insisted on doing right even when it cost them everything. The narrow path between liberation and fear that they walked is one that many people face in wartime. Soldiers who witness crimes by their comrades must choose between loyalty and justice. Civilians who suffer at the hands of their supposed liberators must choose between gratitude and truth. Those who intervene must choose between safety and principle. Most people, faced with these choices, choose the easier path. They look away. They stay silent. They prioritize their own safety and convenience. This is understandable, even forgivable. The costs of speaking out are real and severe. But some people, like Coleman and Margaret, choose the harder path. They speak truth to power. They insist on justice, even when it's futile. They refuse to let crimes be buried in silence. These people pay terrible prices for their courage, but they also preserve something essential: the possibility that truth matters, that justice is worth pursuing, that human dignity is worth defending. Decades after the war, when historians finally began documenting these hidden stories, they relied on people like Margaret who were willing to break their silence. Without these testimonies, this chapter of history would have remained buried, the crimes forgotten, the victims erased. The 14,000 estimated rapes by American soldiers in Europe during World War II represent 14,000 individual traumas, 14,000 lives altered or destroyed. Behind each statistic is a person like Margaret, a woman who experienced terror and violation, who was then pressured into silence, who carried that burden for years or decades. Many of these women never told their stories. They died with their secrets, their pain unacknowledged, their attackers unpunished. The historical record will never capture their full experiences, but the testimonies that do exist, like Margaret's, provide a window into this hidden history. Similarly, the soldiers like Coleman who tried to do the right thing, who intervened to prevent crimes or reported them afterward, represent a different kind of heroism than the conventional military valor we celebrate. Their courage was moral rather than martial, and it often went unrecognized or was actively punished. The American military executed several soldiers for rape during World War II, but the racial disparity in these executions reveals the system's true priorities. Black soldiers were executed for crimes that white soldiers committed with impunity. Justice was not blind. It was deeply, explicitly racist. This reality complicates our understanding of World War II as the good war. The Allied cause was just. Defeating fascism was necessary. But the armies that fought for freedom were themselves deeply flawed, carrying their own forms of oppression and injustice. Black American soldiers fought against Nazi racial ideology while experiencing American racial oppression. They liberated concentration camps while being denied basic rights at home. They risked their lives for freedom they themselves did not fully possess. Coleman's story embodies this painful contradiction. He was willing to die for his country, but his country was not willing to treat him as an equal. He showed extraordinary courage and integrity, but the system punished him for it. He did everything right, and it cost him dearly. The fact that he did it anyway, knowing the consequences, is what makes his choice so remarkable. He could have walked past Margaret that night. He could have looked away, as so many others did. He could have refused to report what happened, avoiding the retaliation he knew would come. But he didn't. He intervened, he reported, he insisted on justice. That choice, made in a moment of crisis by an ordinary soldier, represents something profound about human moral capacity. Even in systems designed to suppress justice, individuals can choose to pursue it. Even when institutions fail, people can insist on doing right. The legacy of Margaret and Coleman's story is not about the justice because they achieved none. The attackers were never punished. The system never acknowledged its failures. No apologies were offered, no amends made. Their legacy is about the importance of truth-telling, of refusing to let crimes be buried in silence, of insisting that what happened matters even when everyone in power wants it forgotten. Margaret kept her promise to Coleman. She told her story when it became history, so that the truth would not be lost. That truth is uncomfortable. It challenges our preferred narratives about World War II. It forces us to acknowledge that liberation was complicated, that heroes could also be perpetrators, that the systems we trust to provide justice often fail. But uncomfortable truths are still truths. They deserve to be told, to be remembered, to be integrated into our understanding of history. The thousands of women who were sexually assaulted by Allied soldiers during World War II deserve to have their experiences acknowledged. The soldiers like Coleman who tried to prevent these crimes or seek justice for them deserve to be recognized. This is not about diminishing the Allied victory or the genuine heroism of millions of soldiers. It's about understanding the full complexity of war, the full humanity of those who experienced it. War brings out the best and worst in people, often simultaneously. Acknowledging the worst does not erase the best. It simply makes our understanding more complete, more honest. Margaret Ashford and James Coleman never became famous. Their story was buried for decades, but their choices in those critical moments in 1904 represent something essential about human dignity and moral courage. They remind us that doing the right thing often costs everything, but it's still worth doing. They remind us that one act of courage, one insistence on truth, one refusal to look away can matter profoundly, even if it changes nothing in the immediate moment. Coleman saved Margaret's life. Margaret preserved the truth of what happened. Together they left a testament to the possibility of integrity in systems designed to suppress it. When everyone else chose convenience over justice, they chose justice. When everyone else chose silence over truth, they chose truth. When everyone else looked away, they refused to. That is their legacy, and it endures. If this story opened your eyes to a side of history you've never heard before, help us bring more hidden truths to light. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these untold stories that challenge what we thought we knew about the past. If you're already part of our community, thank you. Your like helps this story reach others who need to hear it, and the algorithm favors videos that spark conversation. So drop a comment below. What surprised you most about Margaret and Coleman's story? Do you think we do enough to acknowledge the complicated truths of history? Your engagement doesn't just support this channel, it ensures that voices like Margaret's, silenced for 50 years, finally get heard. It honors the courage of people like Sergeant Coleman, who did the right thing when everyone else looked away. Subscribe, like, comment. Let's make sure these stories are never buried again.